Good afternoon. My name is David Johnson. I am the Executive Director for the Center of Ethics and the Rule of Law at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us for the third in our virtual series on briefing the dimensions of the Israel-Hamas war. The ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas raises critical questions about the application and interpretation of the law of armed conflict, also known as LOAC, which is also called International Legal Principles Governing the Conduct of War. The Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law is pleased to host experts in national security, military strategy, and the law of war to discuss these critical topics. SERL is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to preserving and promoting ethics and the rule of law in national security, warfare, and democratic governance. Affiliated with the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania, SERL draws upon the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise in times of war and contemporary transnational conflicts. SERL brings together scholars, policymakers, and professionals across the legal, military, intelligence, and business sectors to research, analyze, and make policy recommendations that address today's challenging issues, such as domestic violent extremism, the use of autonomous weapons, and protection of civilians in war zones. SERL carries out its mission through conferences, symposia, research and policy papers, briefings, blog submissions, student projects, and other activities. Now, I'd like to start with a few housekeeping rules before we begin. Questions will be taken from the audience in the last 20 minutes. To ask a question, please enter into the Q&A box at any particular point in the conversation and click send. This event will be recorded and posted on SERL's YouTube channel. I'm pleased to introduce the moderator, Professor Claire Finkelstein, who started SERL in 2012 and served as SERL's faculty director since its inception. She's the Algernon Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. Professor Finkelstein.
Thank you so much, Dave. And I'm very excited about today's briefing at a critical moment in the Israel-Hamas war as we see very important developments in the past week. I'm also particularly excited because today's guests are both members of the SERL Executive Board and two of the greatest minds in national security that you can hear today. First, General Cartwright served as commander of U.S. Strategic Command before being nominated and appointed as the 8th Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the nation's second highest military officer. General Cartwright served his 4-year tenure as Vice Chairman across 2 presidential administrations and constant military operations against diverse and evolving enemies. He became widely recognized for his technical acumen, vision of future national security concepts, and keen ability to integrate systems, organizations, and people in ways that encouraged creativity and sparked innovation in the areas of strategic deterrence, nuclear proliferation, missile defense, cybersecurity, and adaptive acquisition processes. He was also known as Obama's favorite general, and he is, of course, a beloved member of the SERL Executive Board and has recently joined. I'd now like to introduce Morton Halprin. Dr. Halprin is the chair of the SERL Executive Board. He served in the Obama, Clinton, Nixon, Johnson, and Kennedy administrations, including as director of the policy planning staff at the Department of State from 1998 to 2001. Dr. Halprin worked for many years for the American Civil Liberties Union. He was director of the Center for National Security Studies from 1975 to 1992. He was also the director of the Washington office of the ACLU. Dr. Halprin taught at Harvard and as a visitor at other universities, including Columbia, George Washington, and Yale. He has been affiliated with a number of think tanks, including the Center for American Progress, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Century Foundation, and the Brookings Institution. He is also the author of numerous books and articles, including Bureaucratic Politics and Foreign Policy and Top Secret. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. So I'm going to begin by doing, as we always do now, a brief summary of what has happened during the week, and then we're going to launch in and talk about some of these developments. Last week, we said it was possible that the IDF would begin flooding the tunnels with seawater, and that has now indeed happened. So perhaps surprisingly, we have heard relatively little from the families of the hostages about this move, and that may suggest that the Israeli government is keeping in close contact with them and has explained this move in a way that perhaps does not raise great additional concern for the safety of their loved ones, but on the face of it, there is concern about whether or not the hostages are put at additional risk with the flooding of the tunnels. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council proposed a resolution to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, which the United States vetoed. The U.S. was the only country to vote against the resolution, with 13 countries voting for it. The U.K. abstained. Following that, on Tuesday of this week, the UN General Assembly voted in favor of a ceasefire. That is a non-binding resolution, which the U.S. has no ability to veto. The vote was 153 countries voting in favor, 10 voted against, and there were 23 abstentions. The resolution was put forward by the UN's Arab Group and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. It is also worth noting that last week on Wednesday, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Guterres, invoked Article 99, which is a rare move. It is a rule that allows the Secretary General to bring the Security Council's attention to any matter that, quote, may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. This was considered a controversial move by some and was protested by Israel. Last week, Secretary of State Blinken warned that Israel is not doing enough to protect civilians. And meanwhile, we continue to see increased activity from Hezbollah, from Hamas on the West Bank, and from Houthi rebels, the latter of which have been attacking U.S. ships, Saudi Arabia, and other ships in the Red Sea. And just in the last 3 hours, the AP is reporting that a missile fired from Yemeni rebels was fired into the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And also we have learned that at least the U.S. is suggesting that these long-range missiles are given to Yemeni rebels by Iran. So I'm going to ask General Cartwright to give us a little bit of an update and explanation as to what may be going on here with these long-range missiles and the Iran connection.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for hosting us. These have been really valuable. I've really enjoyed the first two, were exceptional, so high bar to go against. On the missile, what's unique here is that up until now, the Houthis, whose missiles have been provided for the most part by Iran, have not had the range and the reach to get to Israel. This appears to be an escalation in capability and a transfer in technology and potentially actual parts and missiles to the Houthis in order to reach Israel. There's discussion right now, I'm not sure that it's conclusive, that the Israelis have already used an Arrow missile to shoot one of these missiles down. So this seems to be another escalation. It seems to give now another group the ability to reach out and touch Israel from afar. This is a ballistic missile. It is not going to be precise where it hits, and it's probably designed not to be precise. In other words, there would be significant civilian casualties if it got to Israel. And so this just is a further escalation of the capabilities that have been provided to terrorist groups in order to continue this kind of broad regional terrorism that's going on right now. I think in the last few days, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 76 attacks on U.S. forces and commercial shipping in the region. And so this escalation is dangerous. It's just plain dangerous.
Can you tell us, Jim, a little bit about these missiles and their expected capacities? So we do believe that these missiles have the ability to reach all the way to Israel?
Right. That is the implication right now, is that this is an additional class of missiles that have been given to the Houthi rebels. And up until now, they've been able to reach pretty far out, but not to Israel. Now it appears that Israel is within the range of this ballistic missile. So in other words, it goes up, it's shot up into the air, it flies at what is called a minimum energy trajectory to get it to the furthest range. And it has an ability in that range to reach Israel and then on an impact explode. Now, how big the warhead is, some of the details are still not really known. We know what that class of missile potentially could carry, but this is a definite escalation in the activity.
Do you expect that these missiles could be intercepted by Iron Dome technology, or do you think
Iron Dome, no. This would be in the Arrow or their intermediate, Israelis' intermediate capability, or Patriot or THAAD.
Okay, so we're going to swing back to these issues when we talk about Iran and the broadening tension. I want to go back to the ceasefire issue, Mort, and come to you and ask whether or not the U.S. was right to veto the Security Council ceasefire resolution. I think you're on mute, Mort.
I think that was an appropriate decision. The resolution was unbalanced. It did not condemn the original attack. It did not call for the immediate release of all the hostages, and it was focused on Israeli conduct and not on the conduct of Hamas. I think also there is a long history of UN resolutions that are one-sided on this issue, and therefore I do not think that the UN is appropriate body to engage in a constructive path towards the resolution of the conflict. There's also the danger that, given that Russia and China have vetoed the Security Council, that if you start relying on Security Council resolutions, you've in effect invited Russia and China into the conflict. So I think the urge on Israel to cut back on its bombing and to seek some pause in the hostilities to bring about further hostage exchanges and humanitarian relief is essential. And the U.S., I think, is doing that unilaterally and should continue, in my view, should continue to do that. But I think that the UN resolution has drawbacks that would lead me not to say that was the most effective route.
Are you, by the way, surprised that the UK abstained from the veto rather than siding with the US on this, and that France actually, of course, a staunch US ally, voted in favor of the resolution?
Well, I think both Britain and France, as is the United States, now are in the midst of internal conflict about how to view this conflict and what to do about it. And so I'm not surprised that the French and the British voted the way they did.
Jim, where do you stand on the issue of a possible ceasefire? Mort is, of course, saying that while he was in favor of the U.S. veto of the Security Council resolution, he would like to see an appropriate ceasefire or pause in hostilities. Where do you stand on that?
I tend to lean in the same direction that Mort did. I guess, to me, we've had one ceasefire, and it was with limits set on the need for transfer of hostages, the need for allowing for humanitarian assistance to get in. and in that activity, it stayed in place until the Hamas side of the equation stopped the aid going in and wouldn't give up any more hostages. And so to me, the Israeli calculus here of why you would have a pause is in line with what you would normally see in a ceasefire, and is tactically timed correctly. Where the UN is just a blanket activity, the other thing that would concern me here is that pauses in activity like this are also time to rearm and reposition for another offensive. And, historically, these ceasefires tend to increase the casualties, not decrease them, increase the length and time that the conflict goes on. Now, these are all hypothetical future, assumptions, but historically, that's what happens. And so I worry about that. If you look at the first few hours of this conflict, over somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 missiles and rockets into Israel. That kind of firepower resupplied again is going to be very difficult on this conflict.
Mort, do you agree that a pause in hostilities would likely increase the casualty count over time and just give Hamas a chance to rearm? And maybe you could speak a little bit about the opportunity for bringing in more humanitarian aid.
Yeah, I think that to me is the critical point. We're dependent to some extent on Hamas for precise casualty figures, and I think it's appropriate, as people do, to point that out. But there is no doubt that there is a grave humanitarian crisis on the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip. And it's a humanitarian crisis caused in large part by the Israeli bombing strategy and policy. And I think it's important to try to bring that under control. The Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has said Israel must reduce its level of bombardment. The president has made it clear that he's unhappy with the level. And I think we all need to be concerned about the humanitarian crisis. So I think a temporary halt and facility to bring in more humanitarian aid is imperative, and it needs to be used to establish a continuing process of bringing in humanitarian. It's not enough to have it come in during the ceasefire. There needs to be a mechanism to ensure that the civilian population is not starved, that has adequate water and food and medical attention, and that goes on as the hostilities resume, which probably means Israel needs to change its strategy and tactics for fighting the war. But I think it needs to do that in any case because of the humanitarian catastrophe, regardless of whether it is precisely a violation of the laws of war. It is a humanitarian catastrophe, and I think we have to deal with that reality.
Good. So let's talk a little bit about this new move of flooding the tunnels. This is very hard to tell what has resulted or will result from this. It's likely to have the impact of bringing Hamas fighters up to the surface and may even bring the hostages up to the surface. Jim, do you think that this could actually be a strategy for trying to rescue the hostages, or do you think it is likely to be placing hostages at greater risk?
Well, my sense is that in any kind of warfare where you have trenching and tunnels and things like that, those are defensive means to protect force, to protect valuable commodities, hostages and other things. And so that would bubble up and that would create targets potentially that would appropriate to be addressed by Israeli fires. Is it part of a hostage rescue? That's kind of an indirect approach to do it. It's a stretch. It might out of serendipity do it. but generally, you're going to hide those hostages in a dispersed way. And so putting them all in a tunnel would not normally be an approach that a a hostage organization would go to. They would disperse these in all kinds of different areas so that one type of attack would not get them all rescued, so to speak. So I don't tie the tunnel flooding to that as much as I tie it to let's get everything up and out, get the targets up where we can actually get at them without a lot of ambiguity about where we are directing fires.
Israel has suggested this is a method of trying to reduce civilian casualties because it reduces the need to engage in above ground bombing. Does that seem likely to you, Jim, as a
It does. I mean, it's
rational-
very difficult to decide what an aim point is when something's underground. If you can get it up and above and flush them out, many wars have done this kind of strategy. Get them out of those tunnels and out of the trenches. Then you have a much better chance of one, recognizing friend from foe, and two, putting more precise fires on targets that you know where they are.
Mort, you mentioned change in strategy as well. Do you have thoughts about how the Israelis ought to be proceeding? And I gather, since you don't favor a unilateral ceasefire in which that wouldn't be tied to return of hostages, if Hamas is not willing to resume the return of hostages, then Israel would continue hostilities. So how can it do so in a way that would minimize civilian casualties to a greater degree, given whatever the actual civilian death count is? We know it's enormous.
I think it has to cease the bombing of civilian buildings, even if there's some overlap with Hamas targets. It needs to engage in a strategy on the ground, which is carefully targeted at going after particular individuals or particular groups of people. I wouldn't presume to tell them how to fight the war, but the way they're fighting it now has brought vast, overwhelming international condemnation, in my view, justified, because it is not an overall taking account of the civilian catastrophe that is created. That's separate from the question, which I would not presume to comment on, as to whether any individual strike was in fact a violation of the laws of war. That is a very fact-based determination and depends on intent and what was reasonable to know. And I think something that will be dealt with and needs to be dealt with when the conflict or this particular incident is over. But clearly, the bombing campaign has produced, we all see it in the pictures and the journalism reporting in the International Committee of the Red Cross, in the UN. There's a humanitarian disaster which is getting worse and worse, and the Israelis simply cannot continue the same strategy which has brought about this disaster and will make it worse if it is not stopped.
Yeah, Jim, do you want to add to that?
I mean, the difficulty here also is not to mitigate the humanitarian tragedy that's going on there, is we don't know how many times Israel's forces have aborted attacks because they thought they were going into an area that had too many civilians or had the wrong characteristics to be appropriate. We don't count those numbers. We don't know how many people are alive because of systems like Iron Dome, et cetera, that if they weren't in place would have gone. So there, as Mort says, there is more detail to this that has to be sorted out. But, to just go on the reported casualty counts as a way to approach the problem is not in and of itself sufficient.
Right. And interestingly, on the front page of today's New York Times, there's an article entitled "Civilian Dead Not Sole Issue in Law of War."
Right.
But the interesting thing about the piece, which is billed as an analysis piece, is that the author suggests that perhaps international law is not the only thing we should be considering, and that maybe international law fails to capture our sense of moral outrage, and perhaps suggesting that adhering to international law is not sufficient when we're analyzing the conduct of parties in war. Jim, do you agree with that?
I certainly have sympathy with commanders that are trying to execute under the law of armed conflict and trying to judge between the validity of a target and the potential for collateral damage, humanitarian harm. It's tough. Okay, and we're doing it in the absence of knowing how many times they make those decisions that go right, and how many times there's something there that they didn't see, couldn't sense, wasn't aware of. And I got it. You can, the emotion goes with the loss. Got it. But the reality here on the ground is very difficult to sort out. So that's why things like, okay, how many times did you abort because the criteria were inappropriate? Are you in fact demonstrating will to avoid that? Number one. Number two, are you using fires that are reasonably precise for the technology available to mitigate those collateral damage activities? And doing the best. I mean, is your intent not to destroy the entire civilian population, but to get at those things that law of armed conflict would say are appropriate for the kind of activity going on? And that it's just really, really difficult. And I think that's what the article was saying too, quite frankly.
Right. Mort, what do you think about this issue? Is it enough to say, one might have the sense that public opinion keeps moving the goalposts on Israel, since the argument was, well, you're not abiding by international law. And then if Israel, in effect, has sufficient arguments to suggest they are, the argument comes back, well, that's not sufficient anyway. If you are abiding by international law, so much the worse for international law. What's your view of that?
Well, I think it's not so much the worse for international law, but international law isn't enough. It isn't enough to say, as it isn't in personal life, it's not enough to say, well, you haven't broken any laws when you did something. If it has catastrophic consequences for other people's lives, we feel free to criticize it. And I think the same is true here. Israel, I think, violations of the laws of war are individual responsibilities of individual actors making decisions whether to bomb or not. And those, I think, need to be adjudicated carefully and on the facts. But I think we can look at what has happened in Gaza. We look at what is happening in Gaza and say it just cries out to say that it is not appropriate and can't be a strategy that any government can follow in pursuing its military objectives. And Israel needs to find, as the American government has been urging it and giving it advice from the beginning, it's got to find a strategy that is consistent with ethics, with moral values, as well as with the precise details of the laws of war.
Let's talk about the possibility of a broadening conflict here. So we see increased activity by Hezbollah. We see the increased activity by Houthi rebels that we've been talking about from Yemen. We see increased activity by Hamas in the West Bank. The risk exists that Israel could soon be fighting a multi-front war, fighting not only in Gaza, but in Lebanon, Syria, even possibly Yemen. What, Jim, in your view, are the chances that Israel is going to end up in a multi-front war? And how do you see the U.S.'s stance relative to such a possibility?
My sense is that we are danger close to that happening, but that the mitigators right now, both from Israel and from U.S. supply of technology and capabilities to Israel, things like missile defense have basically given us a much broader decision space, a much broader escalatory ladder on which to maneuver. And so as long as we can continue to knock down the rockets, knock down the missiles coming in from all of those different areas, whether it be the Houthis or the Hezbollah or Hamas, then we've got decision time and we've got options. And I think Washington has done a pretty good job with Israel on making sure that those kinds of assets are available to give that ability to manage the escalation. A. B, the difficult part here is, one rocket that gets through, one large warhead that gets through could be devastating and tip the scales in a way that we don't predict ahead of time. It could be something that lands in Israel proper. It could be something that lands on a U.S. asset in the region. It could be something that lands on a commercial asset in the region. There are any number of things here that could change the calculus. And I think that's where the concern is what don't you know might happen that would change the context in which this war gets fought. And this introduction of the long-range missile really worries me because it moves us more in that direction. Up until now, we've taken these 76 incidents that have gone on in the region and handled them with local fires, defensive systems, quick raids to neutralize, etc. If that doesn't satisfy the ability to contain this in the future, then I think we're dangerously close to a multi-front conflict and something that would escalate. And predicting that escalation is a fool's errand at this end. Unfortunately, you just have to assume the worst, and that's not good.
So what do you think the U.S. stance should be towards this situation and the possibility of escalation? Are we likely to be drawn into, I mean, we may already be in effect in a proxy war with Iran?
Well, I think the U.S. has to make it clear to the Israeli government that it will stand behind it if it has reasonable policies and help to prevent further escalation and give them the military equipment that they need to deal with it. But that cannot be an open-ended commitment. As the government has made clear, it is concerned, and I think properly concerned, that the current Israeli government is not prepared to say that it looks forward to two states living in peace in the area and an end to the conflict based on a two-state solution. It is suggested that it wants to drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank and out of Gaza, and that is not consistent with American policy. It is not. It is a violation of international law, and it is something that has no support in the rest of the world. So I think the U.S. government is quite correct in pressing the Israelis to change the composition of their government so that they can go back to committing themselves to the eventual goal of a two-state solution to the problem. And I think without that, we run a risk that we get drawn into a multi-front war in which the United States and Israel are on one side and the rest of the world is on the other.
So let me press you a little bit on that, because given the situation with Iran, and let's turn to that now in a little bit more detail, do we not undermine our ability to deter Iran the more pressure we put on the Israelis to tone down their offensive? If Iran is aware that we are not prepared to stay the course with Israel, will we not see more support by Iran for Hezbollah, for Houthi rebels, and for Hamas, for that matter?
No, I think we have to persuade Iran that we're prepared to stay the course, but that requires, in my view, showing that we have a policy and that Israel joins us in a policy which is sustainable, which has the support of broad parts of the international community, which is not inconsistent with international, and saying that we're going to stand with Israel. And as Israel announces that its goal is to drive the Palestinians troops out of the territory in the West Bank and at least in Gaza to continue to run it, if not drive them into Egypt, then I think it is not credible to say that we will maintain American support for Israel. We see already the erosion of that support, despite the strong efforts of the Biden administration to get the additional funding. Congress is going home without providing not only the Ukraine funding, but the Israeli funding, which is really fundamentally change in the situation. This is the first time Congress has not been far ahead of the administration in supporting Israel and giving aid to Israel. And I think that is the danger, that the Iranians conclude that the Americans will abandon Israel and perhaps abandon Ukraine unless we have a policy that has broad support in the United States. And we're seeing from the poll data that there is great concern about Israeli policy, which I think will affect American support unless Israeli policy goes back to where it was before.
Well, of course, Congress was very busy yesterday opening an impeachment inquiry on Biden, so I don't think they had time to address the question of support for Israel. Jim, what do you think? Go ahead, Mort.
Well, they did have time. They're doing the defense authorization bill. And that's a place where you'd expect them to put this if there was overwhelming support. And the fact that they're not, the fact that they're going home without it is, I think, a warning sign that Israel is losing the broad support that it's had in the United States.
And Biden has said, has not put any conditions on support for Israeli weapon supplies, interestingly. So Congress and the Biden administration may be in different places on this.
Absolutely.
That's an open question on that NDAA. Jim, talk to us about Iran a little bit and how you see Iranian support for the different foes of Israel and what it takes to deter Iran. You've talked about something called integrated deterrence. Tell us about that and how you see deterrence as working and the U.S.'s power to deter sort of from a distance.
I think, in the case of Iran, you have a country who does not have the fiscal resources to mount an army, navy, air force that has strategic reach. Okay. And so instead, they are empowering these groups to basically do their work for them with some ability and deniability in what happens. Okay. So that's kind of point number one. And this is a different approach to warfare, but not really all that different. It's still proxy warfare at the end of the day. But the strategy up until now has been a boil the frog strategy. How many rockets will you let me shoot at you without you coming back at me, so to speak? Whether it's Syria, whether it is Lebanon, whether it is Yemen, it's just been a boil the frog strategy, and what can I get away with here? But now you're introducing new classes of weapons, the drones, the long-range missiles, and things like that. And so the question here is, what emboldened Iran to think that they can get away with that? And to me, there's a couple of things going on out there that are very hard to put your hands around in a precise way. But you have to admit and understand that the U.S. is tired of forever conflicts. I mean, we're war weary, not the military, the country. Okay, and where resources are being applied and whatnot, and how to handle that, and that manifests itself in many of the discussions that you hear on the floor of the Congress. So there's that piece. There is a tacit support from both Russia in particular, but also China, that they're aligned indirectly or directly with Iran in support of their end states, and so that's a difficult problem. So Iran now is in a position to say, well, I could probably push this further based on one or all of these different things that I'm assuming are true. Now, those assumptions may not be true. It may not be true that U.S. is sufficiently war weary that another Beirut barracks incident or something like that wouldn't get the American population in a very different place. So there's that piece. It's not necessarily true that China in particular would support anything that Iran wants to do. And so we're tiptoeing on not attacking Iran directly in their homeland, but we are attacking their positions forward if they fire on us. So this calculus is very unstable right now. But I think Iran has made the assumption that tacitly they've got the support and the environment in which they can do what they have started to do in Israel.
That's a little bit
So,
surprising, given the fact that under the Trump administration, the U.S. Took out General Soleimani in Iraq, and that there has been, since the Iran nuclear deal fell apart, a widening gap between the U.S. and Iran, a worsening of relations. And of course, Iran had every reason to expect that the U.S. would stand firmly behind Israel. So it's a little bit surprising that Iran might have thought that they could get away with this level of support for the foes of Israel.
I guess I would disagree, Claire. I think that they've looked at the, kind of the how much skin in the game is the U.S. willing to put in, and how long, and will they in fact get directly involved in this activity with Israel or not, and what would pull the U.S. in? And I just think they're pushing the limits as hard as they can, but they don't want to see the U.S. do strikes inside of Iran. And I don't think the U.S. really right now politically is in a position that it might want to do something like that unless there's a dramatic change.
Mort, how do you see the issue of?
No, I think part of the problem is that the United States government has not explained to the American people just what the rationale for the deployments that we have is, and what would trigger further deployments or the use of military force. I would bet almost no Americans know that we have forces in Syria. I mean, it is extraordinary that we have forces in Syria. There's no congressional authorization for it. There's no public explanation for it. What is their mission? What do they do day to day? None of that's been discussed, nor have we discussed what kind of commitments we have to Israel in the event that there is a multi-front war. I think we urgently need that debate in the United States.
I agree.
Congress can arbitrarily say no to even providing equipment. And we've got this peculiar thing where we only use military force if it's as a direct attack, because the rationale for the use of military force is self-defense. I think we need a broader authorization from the Congress if as this thing heats up, to say, what is the purpose? What will trigger further U.S. military force, and show that the American people are united and understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. But to go forward with this, in effect, secret U.S. deployment, secret from the American people, and that there's been no explanation, no rationale, no effort to get Congress to explicitly approve, I think is extraordinarily dangerous, and runs the risk that when the end will say no, because the Congress won't go along because it hasn't been asked to authorize this policy in advance.
Do you think, Mort, from this standpoint, that it was a mistake for U.S. to pull forces out of Afghanistan? Now, you may have thought it was a mistake anyway, but does this underline the difficulty of that move, especially if the presence of those forces was already authorized under the 2001 AUMF?
The problem with the withdrawal from Afghanistan is that, in my view, we had an objective that we never could meet, and that there would be a debacle whenever we withdrew, just as there was in Vietnam, because again, we had an objective that could not be met. And I think whenever we withdrew, whichever president, whether it was Trump or Biden or the next president, whenever we withdrew from Afghanistan, you would have had the same kind of debacle the same kind of leaving behind of the next batch of people who helped us. There was no way we were going to take everybody who helped us, and there was no way we were going to avoid the last minute scramble that we saw in Vietnam and we saw in Afghanistan. So I think President Biden has gotten an unfair criticism, as if there was a way to get out that could have prevented the Taliban from taking power or destroyed or made it more orderly than it was. I think
President Biden, you mean?
President Biden, the mistake was to go in with a broader objective than just doing what we could to avenge 9/11, but then making clear to the Afghan people that we could not provide the protection for them against their own internal enemies indefinitely, and thinking that if only one more strategy or one more escalation, we could have done so. The damage was done by having an objective that was unobtainable, and no president could, in my view, have done any better than Biden did.
So let's turn to some of our questions now. For members of the audience, please put your questions in the chat. Feel free to indicate whether or not you want me to mention your name in the questioner, but I'll assume that you do unless you tell me otherwise. From Sophie Adams, how concerned should we be about a Russia-Hamas alliance? Is American support for Israel complicated by our efforts in Ukraine? Jim, do you want to take that?
My sense is probably the Russia-Hamas alignment right now, other than a tacit support and potentially some armament, equipment, whatever that could be transferred, is what we're seeing. And that's probably where it'll stay. Russia has its hands full in Ukraine, and so going beyond Ukraine is a little bit harder for them. Is America's support for Israel complicated because of Ukraine? Of course it is. One, it is of the same ilk in that defensive capabilities in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, all of which are in short supply, are now being drawn in two directions. And that's always been very difficult. We don't tend to buy them in the quantity that we need for the types of ISR and the types of missile defenses that would be aligned with this much usage. So you can see things like Patriot batteries are basically all gone. They're all going to these conflicts because they're so effective in what they do. Intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance drones, and all other types of activities are being drawn. So yes, there is a complication there, but not sufficient to make it to change the will in any way. That both of these conflicts need to be addressed, and we have the capability to do it.
Yeah, good. Okay, from an anonymous Zoom user, mentions, putting allegedly indiscriminate bombing aside for the moment, Hamas stores hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel, as well as 3 to 4 months of water, food, medicine, medical supplies, etc., that it denies to innocent Gazan Palestinians. And I'm going to add a question here, since the questioner doesn't ask a question, but shouldn't Hamas have to give those stores over to the Palestinian people? And you could even say, shouldn't further humanitarian aid be conditional on their doing so? Mort, do you want to answer that?
No, because that's punishing the civilians of Gaza for the evils of Hamas. I think we have every right to point that out. I think the Israelis have a right to demand that the humanitarian supplies that go in are monitored by appropriate institutions to make sure they don't go to Hamas. But I think it is not appropriate to say that it's okay for the citizens of Gaza to be starved, to be deprived of medical care, because Hamas could help them if it wanted to. I think we have to point out the evil of Hamas, but we also have to be concerned with the humanitarian crisis that Hamas has created in Gaza and will continue to create.
Is there not a concern that as more humanitarian aid comes in, Hamas will manage to increase its stores of those supplies, and that in fact we're just helping Hamas to continue its war efforts by supplying those supplies?
Well, here I agree with the Prime Minister of Israel. The only solution is to drive Hamas out of physical control of Gaza. I think that's an appropriate Israeli objective. I think it is one that can be met and has to be met, but it has to be met in a way that takes account of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and openly creates the possibility of a future for Gaza, which is independent of Hamas, but also independent of Israeli day-to-day control.
Okay, so next question from an anonymous user. Israel has shown itself capable of highly surgical strikes where only specific apartments, for example, are targeted within a larger structure and the entire structure remains standing. Yet most of its attacks since October 7th have been of a more general nature, and the user calls them carpet bombing missions that inflict maximum civilian damage. Should Israel not be engaging in more surgical strikes, Jim?
I've seen this argument in several different forms, over the life of this particular conflict. One, Hamas tends to go underground, and so individual apartments, are not necessarily the valid targets, but the capability does exist to go in that way with certain platforms and certain weapons and whatnot. And to the extent that it's possible, I believe that Israel has done that. But the broader ambiguity here, an argument was being made that a lot of the weapons that Israel was dropping were not precision guided. Okay. And therefore, some percentage, some large percentage were basically gravity fall bombs. But that belies the capability of the delivery platform to be precise. So in other words, I can either make the bomb precise or I can make the platform precise, or I could do both, technically. And so the capabilities that we gave to Israel in the F-35 and then improved when the conflict started, et cetera, make the platform very smart. And so it's a little bit deceiving to say that the gravity bomb was not precise and therefore it was just thrown and carpet bombed, when the reality is the delivery platform is extremely precise. And so, you're seeing people talk past each other on these conversations about, are you using precision weapons and are you doing the right things? And I don't know sortie for sortie, but I do understand the capabilities of the platforms are substantially greater than anything that we had in the region before, and we improved upon substantially better than anything that was out there for this conflict. We gave them significant upgrades so that they could, in fact, if they wanted to, be very precise in what they were doing. Again, the fog of war is out there.
But Jim, let's just hone in on that point for another moment, because that is a pretty important point, right? The question is, would there be sufficient military advantage from that kind of very narrow, targeted strike that you could expect to drive Hamas out of Gaza if you restricted yourself in a dense urban area to that kind of very, very narrow targeted strike? What do you think about that?
My sense is that you can surface them. And if it's in combination with ground forces, you can be very, very precise about what you get. If you use one to flesh them out, so to speak, and another force that's very precise, say ground forces, to then address them on the ground. The difficulty here is getting them out of the buildings, getting them out of the tunnels, et cetera, into the open where you can get at them. I mean, this is a very coarse discussion of it, but the idea here is, yes, the precision's available to start to flesh them out. If they are at the base of a tall building, it's very difficult to not impact the building. Okay, and that's where they tend to go. They're not stupid. They're going to go to those areas, particularly if they do not care about the residents of the building, they being Hamas.
Right, right. And of course, that's maybe part of the strategy of flooding the tunnels with seawater. And speaking of that, we had said earlier that it may be a method of minimizing civilian casualties. Now, there is a question here about the environmental implications of flooding the tunnels. The UN published a report years ago saying that Gaza would become uninhabitable by 2020. There's concern that flooding the tunnels with seawater could ruin all of the water available for crop irrigation and for human consumption. I've also heard concerns, I'm now adding to the questioner's question, that it could end up imploding civilian infrastructure above the tunnels. Mort, do you have any comment about this strategy and whether or not it's a method of reducing civilian casualties or not?
I don't. I just don't have any insight into that.
Jim, any thought about it?
I remember the argument about the seawater in the tunnels and the impact on crops. And the assumptions here were one, that the seawater was persistent and stayed there. Two, that the tunnels were very close to the surface. Almost all of the coastal agriculture in the United States has seawater under it. Okay, it's a question of, if you irrigate on top of it, you press the salt water out and you can get crops. So, I'm not a scientist on this, but I remember going through this, in several meetings, at the national security level, and the argument is kind of weak. It assumes a lot of things that are not in place. Persistent presence of that salt water. I mean, once you flood them, it's either going to seep down into the ground, or you have to keep flooding constantly and pumping, and that's not what's going on here.
Okay, that's an important distinction. We have time for just one or two more questions from Dan Lowe. Biden recently called Israel's efforts reckless. How does that square with the facts on the ground and other statements from this administration praising Israel's efforts to mitigate collateral damage? Mort, do you want to take that?
Well, I think you have both. I think Israel is doing a lot of things to mitigate civilian damage. And when the Israelis say that they pay more attention to this than almost any other country, I think that's true. But it's also true that they're doing things that do not mitigate civilian damage, and that the result of the bombing has been a humanitarian catastrophe. So I think that both the case, and the administration is, like all administrations, has people with differing views, a range of different concerns. And so you hear both expressed. And the problem is, we need to come to some more comprehensive understanding with Israel about what the long-run strategy is for Gaza once they drive Hamas out, and for Palestine as a whole once this current military conflict comes to an end. Without an agreement on a long-range solution and a public explanation of it and a buy-in by the American people and the Israeli population, I think we're headed for greater disaster.
And let me ask you a follow-up question, actually, in a related vein, Mort. We have seen a report in the last 24 hours that a Hamas leader said that possibly formal recognition of the state of Israel by Hamas might be a path towards a negotiated settlement to the end of the war. Do you see any avenues for negotiation around that?
I think there's always has to be avenues for negotiations. I think the starting key is an Israeli government which asserts that it has no interest in running Gaza, that it supports an independent Palestinian state, a demilitarized but independent Palestinian state, which includes Gaza, portions of Jerusalem, and the West Bank, and that it is willing to negotiate steps towards that and steps in the meantime that assure the dignity and the well-being of the Palestinian people, as long as they do not tolerate leaders that are committed and capable of doing what was done to Israel in October. We need to remember always that that's where this current crisis starts, and we need to see signs that the Palestinian people will not tolerate it, and that Israel and Palestine share a common desire to live in peace with each other.
Thank you very much. Thanks to our audience and particularly to our guests, General James Cartwright and Dr. Morton Halprin. This has been a fascinating conversation. I want to remind everyone that next week we're going to be doing a deep dive into the situation with the hostages, and we'll also be looking at the situation relating to detainees. We have Ambassador Limbert, who will be joining us, who was held hostage in Iran in 1979 for 9 months, and we'll likely have another guest joining us as well. I'll turn it back over to Dave Johnson, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Yes, I echo it. Thank you. This has been fascinating for joining us today. And as Professor Finkelstein stated, our next installment in the series will be on Thursday, December 21st at 12 noon Eastern Time, discussing the complexities of the hostage situation, with news of Palestinian men being held by Israeli forces in Gaza. And the video recording of this event will be up on Searle's YouTube channel in the next couple days. And thank you all, and we will see you next week.